Thank you all for coming. I've been around government for many, many years as a municipal attorney and school board attorney and whatever, and I always found it very exciting when members of the public took the time to come and participate. So you're welcome. And with that, my name is Ned Julian. I am the designated hearing officer for this hearing. The hearing is governed by Florida Statute 1006.28, and heck on. The statute provides that individuals who may petition the board concerning a textbook or textbooks. The hearing is to be conducted by someone who is not employed by the school district or related to anybody, school board members. The hearing is not subject to the provisions of Chapter 120. Florida has a very extensive Administrative Procedures Act that governs many procedures by both state and local agencies, but this proceeding is exempt from Chapter 120, and basically the board has a policy, and the parties have discussed the parameters of presentation, and after the hearing is concluded, within 14 days I will submit a formal recommended order to the school board, and then the school board will make its decision concerning that document. Now we have a lot of time. The parties tentatively agreed that the petitioners will each make an opening statement, 15 minutes plus or minus. Then Ms. Baxter will respond on behalf of the school district and the superintendent and the board, plus or minus 15 minutes. And then each side is going to present whatever material they want me to consider in arriving at my decision. And then when everybody is finished with that phase, the parties will each be given an opportunity to close. Now, I don't want anybody to feel like they haven't had an opportunity to say everything they want to say, so I'm not going to run a time clock, but I assume that you will be conscious and conscientious about it, and we'll move forward. The objections have been directed to two textbooks, Biology by Miller and Levine, and Elevate Science by Miller, Padilla, and Weissession. Biology is a high school textbook, and Elevate Science, I believe, is a seventh grade textbook. We have objections filed by Sidney Golaji to both books, Nathan Joyner to Biology, the Hoffpowers to both books, and Mr. Robinson to both books. So even though some of the objectors are not here, I think between Mr. Joyner and Mr. Robinson, the scope of the objections will pretty well be covered.
Probably redundantly.
Now, this hearing is governed by the School Board Rule 2520, and specifically the provisions well, didn't bring that page. But anyway, the format is prescribed by policy. Now, the Galogi objection basically says, either find an objective and balanced textbook or develop supplemental avenues that present the both for and against the theory of evolution. That same objection has been presented by Mr. Galogi, or Sidney Galogi, I guess it may be Mrs. Galogi, to Elevate Science. So the objections are all the same, basically, to each of the textbooks. Let's see, Mr. Joyner says, please replace this textbook with one that doesn't teach evolution, such as a factual matter. And then Joan Hoffpower has objected to Elevate Science, and her objection states, find or develop material which teaches all theories of the origins of life in an objective manner. By scientific method, since Darwin's theory is thoroughly explored, I feel it is best to explain all theories in an objective manner. Many qualified scientists do not believe the fossil record is not solid enough to present it as fact. And then Brent Hoffpower directs his to biology, and his statement is, find or develop curriculum that presents an objective case both for and against evolution. And then Mr. Robinson, going to Elevate Science, develop a curriculum which presents the fact that evolution is theory and not fact, making room for other beliefs. And that same objection goes to biology. So we're going to start with opening statements, and I think we'll start with Mr. Robinson. Now, if you will speak directly into the microphone, I don't know how this system works, but I find that sometimes people turn away from the microphone, then we don't hear everything they have to say.
And if I can just jump in real quick, Mr. Julian, I did want you to know that the Hoffpowers have submitted a written statement.
Right, I have that
as well.
statement.
Okay, so
It will be part of our record.
Well, I want to thank you for the opportunity to have my objection heard. My name is Al Robinson. I am a resident of Stewart and a retired teacher. I spent most of my career teaching sixth grade in a middle school environment, and I understand the value of learning. And I must also say that I find it interesting that you said that we are making history in the fact that there have been no other cases of objections, which in a history of this subject I find difficult to understand. First, I would like to begin at a place of common ground. Martin County students ought to explore scientific questions, learn about scientific evidences, develop critical thinking skills, and respond appropriately and respectfully to differences of opinion about controversial issues. Because of this, I am concerned with the presentation of the material that relates to the origin of species as seen in Miller and Levine biology textbook. And I might add that while I also looked at the 7th grade textbook, my comments are directed towards the high school biology book. And probably there are parallel objections. Florida statutes declare that materials recommended for instruction should be accurate, objective, and balanced. Within the scientific community, the origin of species is a debated topic. Since there is controversy within the scientific community, it is unbalanced to present evidence from only one side. And to present that one side as seemingly factual is also not accurate. I believe the introduction of the textbook highlights the argument that I'm going to be making. It says, don't just memorize today's scientific facts and ideas, and please don't just believe them just because they are in a textbook. The text states in the beginning of Unit 5, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, whose development beautifully demonstrates the nature of science, is the best scientific explanation for many kinds of patterns among organisms. Evolutionary theory demonstrates and explains relationships between structures of living things and their functions, mechanisms of change and their effects, and patterns of change over time. Well, evolution does give one explanation of all these things, but as was asked of the students at the beginning of this textbook, they must not believe these facts and ideas just because they are in this textbook. If that is how the information was presented on this origin of life in this text, then I would not be sitting here. Even within the scientific community, researchers are still trying to resolve some of the questions that evolutionary theory raises. We must have academic honesty with the questions that remain unanswered. And here is the crux of my argument. If we are to maintain the three values found in the state of Florida statutes for instructional materials, which are objective, accurate, and balanced learning, then we must present the facts while being honest about scientific controversy.
Mr. Joyner?
At this time, is it only the opening statements?
Yes, sir.
So,
Now, if you would speak directly into the mic, be sure, because we're recording and we want to make sure we have a good record.
did I bring it forward
You
a
can
little
pull
bit?
it closer to you.
Okay.
Is it working?
Yeah, I believe it's working. How's that? All right. I would like to acknowledge all of the board members here and also our mediators and everyone who just came out. And thank you all for being here. I'm so privileged and honored to be a part of these proceedings. It's encouraging to see that our community is reaching out and showing support of our school governing body. As I'm sure you are aware, Martin County, our county, has the best performance in Florida when it comes to test scores and graduation rate. That is something we can be proud of and certainly give credit to the leadership spearheading these results. Today I am here not to discredit or undermine our faculty, but to take the chance that I've been given to objectively disagree with the high school book titled Biology by Miller Levine, published by Pearson. However, I want to iterate that I'm not here to withstand anyone's beliefs or actions at this time. I'm simply here to support our wonderful school leadership and speak objectively on behalf of this newly adopted book.
All right. Ms. Baxter?
And Mr. Julian, on behalf of the district, I have, sitting also at the table is our Chief Academic Officer, Dr. Tracy Miller, and our Science Coordinator, Valerie Gaynor, and they will be presenting on behalf of the district.
All right. Do you have an opening statement?
Yes.
I do, thank you.
Would you state your name clearly for the record?
Sure, Tracy Miller, Chief Academic Officer for the Martin County School District. Thank you as well for being here today for the 2018 Instructional Materials Adoption Hearing, which is part of the Florida Department of Education approved process for the adoption of instructional materials here in Florida. I am Dr. Tracy Miller, Chief Academic Officer for the school district, and I'm here today representing the many teachers, administrators, parents, and local community members who took part in the 2018 science textbook adoption for which this hearing is a part. I'm also here to speak to the expectations of the Florida Department of Education set forth in the course code directory and the test item specifications in terms of the requirements for teaching science in the state of Florida, specifically for biology and grade 7 comprehensive science. I'd like to just speak to the adoption process a little bit, especially we have a lot of people in the room who may not be familiar with the process. Our instructional materials adoption follows Florida Statute 1006.40, specifically Sections 3D, and is designed in part to assure that all the materials are aligned to the next generation science standards and that they are, in fact, as you mentioned, accurate, objective, balanced, non-inflammatory, current, free of pornography, and material prohibited under Section 847.0112. And I'll take just a minute to briefly share the adoption process to date, which is fully outlined in the instructional materials adoption timeline, and it highlights the process that follows our state statute. And in your book, gentlemen, it's tab 2, the instructional materials process. Also included is the training presentation that was provided to members of the instructional materials review team to introduce the team members to their duties and also associate them with all applicable forms and requirements of being a member of this team. Not only have we followed state statute in regard to the selection and adoption of the board-approved materials and adhered to all processes and timelines as outlined by Florida statutes and Martin County School District Board policy, but we have selected materials that are on the state-adopted list. In other words, the state of Florida has gone forth and set a short bid list, which is Exhibit 6B, that outlines the fact that the state of Florida also went through a process to review and approve these materials. And so although not required to go through this entire process, we choose to do this here in Martin County to assure that everyone who wants to have a say in the materials used in our classroom has that opportunity, and to also assure that we are in fact following all of the guidelines and best practices set forth. So in December, we sent invitations to committee members noticing them of a
May I ask
January.
question? What is your opening regarding the issues in the presentation of the objection? Because you'll have time to present your documents.
Okay.
So do you have just a short statement concerning the position of the school board?
So
Or
the school board's
superintendent?
position, thank you, is that we have in fact followed all of the state statutes, and we have recommended and approved materials that are in fact following all of the all of the requirements under the law for state-adopted instructional materials, and the fact that the Florida state standards, specifically the Next Generation Science Standards for science, govern those studies and topics that are required to be taught in our schools. And our position is that that is in fact what happens here in the Martin County School District.
All right. Mr. Joyner, would you care to present material? Mr. Robinson, would you care to present any material or,
Objections?
well, expound on your objection? You made your opening statement, so.
They were objectionable? Okay. Contrary to the admonition cited earlier, that students should not believe ideas just because they're in this textbook, Biology by Miller and Levine presents a very one-sided view. They state, every scientific test has supported Darwin's basic ideas about evolution. Yet, leading evolutionists admit a lack of proof. Biologist Lynn Margulis, late member of the National Academy of Sciences and former University of Massachusetts professor, noted, I was taught over and over again that the accumulation of random mutations led to evolutionary change and led to new species. And I believed it until I looked for evidence. The Royal Society in England is one of the world's most prominent scientific organizations. In November of 2016, the Society held a conference called New Trends in Evolutionary Biology, to discuss whether evolutionary theory, specifically the neo-Darwinian mechanism, can adequately explain the diversity of life or if other propositions are necessary. Around 200 scientists attended this meeting. Over 20 top scientists and scholars from around the world presented. Presenters included the president of the International Union of Physiological Sciences, the president of the European Society of Evolutionary Developmental Biology, a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and a fellow of the American Association of Science. At the conference, Gerd Mueller of University of Vienna's Department of Theoretical Biology and the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research laid out the key ideas of biology that neo-Darwinism has not been able to explain. Most importantly, Mueller highlighted that modern Darwinian theory has failed to explain the origin of new anatomical structures, which was the main goal of Darwin's theory in the first place. Last October, the Royal Society published an article by Mueller where he listed all sorts of challenges to traditional Darwinian theory. To quote him, "Indeed, a growing number of challenges to the classical model of evolution have emerged over the past few years, such as from evolutionary developmental biology, epigenetics, physiology, genomics, ecology, plasticity research, population genetics, regulatory evolution, network approaches, novelty research, behavioral biology, microbiology, and systems biology. In other words, this affects a lot of sciences. Excuse me. Although Mueller is a proponent of evolution, he is one of a growing number of leading scientists who see substantial problems with the mainstream view of neo-Darwinian evolution. In the textbook, Chapter 20 of Miller-Levine also presents a one-sided view of the origin of the first life. It states, "Do we understand the cell completely? Of course not. Many uncertainties remain in our current understanding of cellular complexity. Biologists are still learning how cells function in response to their environments and how they interact with each other. Such uncertainties are as much a part of biology as they are for any experimental science. In many ways, this is good news because it means that there are plenty of mysteries to be solved by the next generation of biologists. Meanwhile, what we do understand suggests that complex cell structures and pathways were produced by known mechanisms of evolutionary change." Miller and Levine paper over some very large, unanswered questions in regard to how the first cell came about. Is it accurate to say that science ascribes the complexity of the cell to known mechanisms of evolutionary change? In fact, Peter Schuster, professor of theoretical chemistry at the University of Vienna, head of the Department of Molecular Evolutionary Biology, the Institute of Molecular Biotechnology in Jena, Germany, and president of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, made the statement, and I quote, "Many different ideas are competing and none is available to provide a sufficiently plausible route to the first living organisms." James Tour and W.F. Chow, professor of chemistry at Rice University, said, "Those who think scientists understand the issues of prebiotic chemistry are wholly misinformed. Nobody understands them. Maybe one day we will, but that day is far from today. It would be far more helpful and hopeful to expose students to the massive gaps in our understanding. They may find a firmer and possibly a radically different scientific theory. The basis upon which we as scientists are relying is so shaky that we must openly state the situation for what it is. It is a mystery. Here's another example of an inaccuracy in the textbook. Under the homologous structures section in Lesson 17, the author states that one kind of homologous structure, vestigial structures, are ancestral features that have lost their function. According to the text, an example of a vestigial structure are the hip bones of dolphins. Why do these vestigial structures persist? One possibility is that they don't affect an organism's fitness, so selection does not eliminate them. But biologists know that hip bones in dolphins do have a function. They provide support for the reproductive organs. And this research was done at the University of Southern California. The article was called Whale Sex. It's all in the hips. And this is Science Daily, September 8th of 2014. Such reasoning lulls students into sloppy and uncritical thinking. This is a problem, not just for science, but for our society as a whole. A democracy needs well-educated citizens who can spot faulty arguments and think for themselves, not docile masses who swallow what they are fed by authority figures. That's it.
Do you have an alternative to propose to the school board?
Yes. Could I state that in my conclusion, in my
Sure.
closing arguments?
Yes. Well, you can,
I can make it now?
yes, if you have an alternative you want the school board to consider, I
All right,
think that's
well-
part of your presentation.
Mm-hmm. Well, my conclusion is that this textbook presents only one side of a controversial scientific subject. And I'm also concerned with the inaccuracies presented. To be accurate, objective, and balanced, more information must be presented than is in this textbook. Therefore, I suggest the best solution would be to develop or procure supplementary materials that offer parallel explanations, and to not use the textbook as the sole source of information. Presenting only one side of a controversy should not be recognized as good teaching.
What parallel theories do you propose?
I do not have that information.
Thank you, sir. All right. Mr. Joyner?
All right. So for the meat and potatoes of my argument, I would like to first point out that my objections to these instructional materials are not solely based on my personal belief system, but are grounded in our established Florida statutes. Florida Statute 1006.31 states that the duty of the Department of Education and the school district instructional materials reviewer are to evaluate instructional materials and only adopt instructional materials found to be, as Al mentioned, accurate, objective, and balanced. As a third party, I have been given the gracious opportunity to weigh in on these decisions by presenting evidence that not all of these instructional materials are accurate, objective, and balanced as they seem, given the overall length and scope of biology as a subject. For the sake of time, I will only present evidence based on whether the instructional materials meet the accurate, objective, and balanced guidelines. Here are my accuracy objections. Number one is the Miller-Urey experiment. When I became aware that the textbook uses the Miller-Urey experiment, I was actually pretty surprised. I studied geology at FAU, Florida Atlantic University, for a semester, and I had to be taught why this experiment is outdated, and it's in the book. According to what modern geology, well, actually, I'll read something over here that I have. Something by David Deamer, a UC Santa Cruz origin of life theorist. This optimistic picture began to change in the late 1970s when it became increasingly clear that the early atmosphere was probably volcanic in origin and composition, composed largely of carbon dioxide and nitrogen rather than mixture of reducing gases assumed by the Miller model. Carbon dioxide does not support the rich array of synthetic pathways leading to possible monomers. So the question arose again, what was the primary source of organic carbon compounds? And University College London biochemist Nick Lane says that the primordial soup theory is past its expiration date. So, according to what modern geology says about the early Earth, there is no reason to continue teaching this tired, inaccurate experiment in light of the new scientific evidence, which I was explained in college. I understand that some would argue that this experiment is a good tool for helping children understand the origin of life, but I would argue that this material should be supplemented with updated evidence. Why should we plant this seed now if we know that it has to be ripped up later on? It's harder to unlearn something, in my opinion, than to just learn it right in the first place. My next inaccuracy argument is getting from building blocks to functioning RNA. The origin of life found in these instructional materials seems to fill in the gaps at times with inaccurate presuppositions. As evidenced by, right here, it says, Robert Shapiro, professor emeritus of chemistry and senior research scientist at New York University, noted in Scientific American, as a published summary, the sudden appearance of large self-copying molecule, such as RNA, is exceedingly improbable. He also said regarding the RNA world model, the flaw is in the logic, that this experimental control done by researchers in a modern laboratory could have been available on the early Earth. And according to Scripps Research Institute biochemist and leading RNA world researcher Gerald Joyce, RNA fails as a plausible candidate for the first building block of life because it is unlikely to have been produced in significant quantities on the primitive Earth. Yes. And here are a couple more cases of inaccuracies in the book. Let me see here. Yes. Sorry, I'm just picking out which part of my evidence I'd like to
Take your time.
show here. Yeah. So right here, chapter 17 states that recently discovered fossils now show clearly how modern species evolved from extinct ancestors. And it also carries an illustration that lines up with artists' conception of extinct and living animals to document the evolution of whales from ancestors that walked on land. But the fossil experts are convinced that none of these animals descended from the animals portrayed before them, and that's why they're all shown at the tips of branches from hypothetical line of ancestry and descent. And even if they were actually related, nothing in the illustration shows how they may have evolved. So basically, to summarize that, they're saying they evolved from, they went from land, between land or sea, but they don't actually have fossil record that backs up that land to sea or vice versa. They just show, or at least in the textbook. Now, whether there's evidence to prove that in the scientific community, it wasn't shown accurately in the textbook. It was just artist rendition and then a picture that kind of invalidates it, showing that, the tree just kind of ends. That they're just kind of hanging out there. So that doesn't really back up what the book was trying to say in that particular a bit there. So I believe that to be inaccurate as well. So now I will go on to my objections for the balanced and objective. So these are inequalities, I believe, that exist. And that is that scientists, I believe, disagree about the explanations for the origin of life. This is something similar to what Al was saying. Chemical evolution is foundational to biology because it deals with how the first self-replicating organisms came to be. Yet it is a field with few firm conclusions and one where scientists continue to vigorously disagree about competing explanations. Peter Schuster, professor of theoretical chemistry at the University of Vienna, and he's the head of the Department of Molecular Evolutionary Biology, that's microevolution, Institute of Molecular Biotechnology, Jena, Germany, and president of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. They say that many different ideas are competing. None of them is available to provide a sufficiently plausible route to the first living organisms. And I'd like to kind of pause there. What we're really saying is that it's kind of like The Land Before Time, if you've ever seen that. It's something that they, I think it's a very entertaining movie. But they kind of show, the fish, crawling out and on the land or something like that. And this is, in this case, they're saying, this is how it happened, or this is how we think it happened. And they're giving these great visuals, and they're showing, this is how life began. Instead of saying, we're not really sure, this is how it could have happened, this is how many scientists believe it happened, but they're not really, they're not giving other, possibilities. I mean, even within people, the realm of those who believe in evolution, which many of those who are, in fact, I would say, 90% of the people I've cited, they do believe in evolution. They just don't agree in exactly how it started. And I believe this textbook is a little too, narrows it down a little too much, and I understand it's to try to get children to understand in just kind of a broad way, but it's not really a critical thinking atmosphere. It's just an atmosphere where the kids just kind of are spoon-fed this stuff instead of understanding, hey, there's a lot of things we don't know. Maybe we need to, imagine a little bit more. Maybe we need to, think of how this could happen. Where should we do experiments? I remember sort of, and this is my own personal experience I'm going to throw out there as a child in school. I remember thinking, I would look at a lizard and I would look at a bird and I would say, they kind of have similar structures, as you're saying in my evolutionary class. I believe they're kind of similar. What's really the difference? And of course, at that age, they were like, it just accept it and whatnot. Dinosaurs were reptiles. And then, of course, I went to college, and I found out that, according to new evidence, dinosaurs had feathers. And so I was, in a sense, kind of vindicated. I felt good about that. But, you know, they didn't have to be so, didn't have to say, you know, for sure dinosaurs were reptiles just because of the bone structure and stuff. And then later they find that there's all these feathers. And where did that come from? You know, they just sort of fill in the gaps in some situations. And that's why I'm showing you this evidence. I'm just want to give you a quick summary of that. So sorry for that deviation there. I'll continue here. George M. Whitesides, professor of chemistry, Harvard University, 2007, Priestley medalist. Most chemists believe, as do I, that life emerged spontaneously from mixtures of molecules in prehistoric Earth. How? I have no idea. Here's one. We still do not have even a plausible, coherent model, let alone a validated scenario, for the emergence of life on Earth. Certainly, this is due not to a lack of experimental theoretical effort, but to the extraordinary intrinsic difficulty and complexity of the problem. A succession of exceedingly unlikely steps is essential for the origin of life, from the synthesis and accumulation of nucleotides to the origin of translation. Through the multiplication of probabilities, these make the final outcome seem almost like a miracle. And that is Eugene Koonin, member of National Academy of Sciences, senior investigator, National Center of Biotechnology Information, National Institutes of Health. So, given the sharp disagreements that exist among scientists who believe in evolution, or believe at least it for it to be evidentially theoretically most likely, it would be poor science education to simply offer students one or more hypothetical explanation about the origin of life without any critical analysis. This would mislead students about the actual state of scientific evidence. And that will be all for my evidence.
Now, do you have a suggestion that the board should consider in terms of textbooks?
I do not, and the reason for not coming prepared with that is that I read the Florida statutes and I did not see really, and this was just possibly my mistake, but I did not really see a place where I was specifically instructed to bring my own supplementary materials. Of course, I did my, when I originally filled up the objection form, I believe that we should have replacement. I also understand that Al was talking about supplementary materials. I did mention supplementary materials as well, but yeah, that's my reasoning.
So that I'm clear, and I think this question goes to both of you, and I think this is what I have gleaned from your presentations, is that you believe the current textbooks, biology and Elevate Science, are deficient, is a good word as any, in that they do not present the possibility of other theories to neo-Darwinism.
Not necessarily other theories, because within evolution there are so many different ways that they believe it started. Even to just add that in, I mean that there's other ways that we believe life started. I'm not proposing any specific way. I'm just saying that I feel like our students deserve other things, other ways to know that it's not just set in stone, that there's a frontier out there that they can really explore. But when you just kind of give them that this is what most people think, well, then they're going to think like most people and not critically.
So you believe that the material should be supplemented
Yes.
by material that suggests there are other other explanations, or that Darwin's explanation needs to be expanded upon.
I would
Correct.
go so far as to say that the material ought to at least point out the fact that there are gaps in the theory, that there is controversy, and makes no mention of controversy.
Sure.
And I think that with some effort, people could come up with materials which present other information on the other side of the controversy.
Okay. Do you accept that, Mr. Joyner?
Yeah, I believe that's a good argument. I do have a closing statement if,
Well, we'll get
if
to
and
that.
when.
There- So your position is that, well, you've stated it.
I'll say that the textbook is only very one-sided. It does not present any clue to young students that there is controversy. It presents it as fact, as information. I will say that there are plenty of process experiments